The wind moaned through empty streets. A chest of relics lay waiting inside a decaying manor, each artifact carrying the weight of betrayal and forgotten lives. A chill wind cut through the narrow alleyways of the medieval market town, carrying the faint tang of smoke from peat fires and the coppery scent of blood-soaked earth. Beneath a tangle of tarpaulins and rotting crates, an old relic lay half-buried. In mud, a tarnished chalice etched with strange symbols that shimmered faintly in the dawn light. A young monk, fingers trembling, traced its surface, feeling the cold bite of iron beneath the worn silver, and a whisper of dread stirred at the base of his spine. Around him, the market hummed with the clamor of traders and the clinking of coins, yet the object seemed to hum with a silence that pressed upon his chest, a hidden history of those who courts and monasteries carried by lords and thieves, alike leaving stories of fever, madness, and vanished heirs. In its wake, candle smoke curled through the dim scriptorium, blending with the acrid scent of ink as the monk scrawled the first warning. In Latin, each stroke a fragile barrier against unseen forces. The black raven alighted on the windowsill, ruffling its feathers, as though sensing the unease that threaded through stone and timber. Outside, the cobblestones glistened with frost and mud, marking the passage of countless feet, each imprint a ghost of toil and devotion, the air vibrating with whispers of debts owed and lives forsaken. Within the monastery, the monk's eyes traced the faded frescoes where saints and sinners alike stared with painted eyes that seemed to follow each hesitant movement. The chalice caught the flicker of candlelight, its surface alive with shadows and reflections, revealing more than metal. It mirrored the desires and fears buried deep in human hearts. The monks, in their habits, moved like phantoms through corridors where the smell of damp stone and old parchment mingled with the iron tang of blood hidden beneath the stones from forgotten rites. Silent prayer against the weight of history pressing upon the roof beams and walls. Outside the town, the peasants bent beneath frost-covered carts, carrying wood and water, the sound of hooves and the scrape of wheels merging with distant church bells tolling, indifferent to suffering. A dog wind near the market edge, its ribs showing beneath matted fur, while traders argued over grains and spices. Oblivious to the relic's shadow, the monk clutched the chalice closer, feeling the chill seeping through his hands, a warning that this object held more than memory. It held consequence, the kind that could unmake lives and unravel the fragile order of abbeys and courts. Night fell, torchlight danced across walls, illuminating grotesque gargoyles, their stone mouths frozen in silent screams. The monk worked in the scriptorium pen, scratching across parchment, writing accounts of misfortune that followed the chalice, each letter heavy with fear and devotion. The raven watched from its perch, eyes reflecting firelight, a silent witness to the unfolding tension in the quiet cloisters. The smell of smoked herring from the kitchen drifted through the air, mingling with candle soot, as if even sustenance were tainted by the relic's presence. The shadowed corners of the town, whispers of vanished merchants and unexplained illnesses, circled like wind through narrow alleys. Children clutched scraps of bread, huddled beneath frosted beams, peering at the chalice from afar without knowing the weight it carried. The monk paused, tracing the symbols with trembling fingers, feeling a pulse as if the chalice itself exhaled a warning. The abbey bell rang, marking hour of vespers, but the sound felt hollow, a reminder that time flowed over. Men indifferent to their fears and hopes, the night deepened cold, pressing against window shutters and doors, each creak of timber echoing like the voice of unseen watchers. The chalice sat upon the desk, reflecting flickering light, a distorted mirror of greed, ambition, and silent curses stitched through generations of kings, lords, and peasants alike. The monk closed his eyes, whispering a prayer for protection, a plea to unseen powers to guard against the relics. Reach his mind filled with visions of vanished heirs, fevered lords, and courts haunted by shadows that could not be exorcised outside. A mist rolled in from the river, enveloping streets and homes in silver. Crates and tarpaulins, soaked with dew, the lingering scent of blood and smoke, hanging in the cold night air. The blackbird lifted into the darkness wings, beating against the cold wind, a messenger between the world of men and the relics hidden. Past in the flickering candlelight, the monk felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, knowing that the story of the chalice was far from complete, and that each day it remained in mortal hands, the threads of fear, secrecy, and forbidden knowledge wove deeper into the tapestry of the living by. Dawn, the first light, would strike the frost-covered cobblestones, again illuminating the relic in new angles. Casting long shadows across the scriptorium, the monk knew the path ahead would be treacherous. The chalice, a silent witness to human folly and a herald of trials yet to come. The room smelled of wet stone and ink, and the air carried a tension that would not easily be lifted. Faintly, as if acknowledging the next chapter in its story, a tale of secrecy, betrayal, and the long shadow that objects of power leave upon those who dare to touch them. The chapel bells tolled through a fog-laden valley, their hollow resonance mingling with the distant bleating of sheep and the rustle of autumn leaves. Across cobblestone streets, inside the castle's armory, a chest of relics had been unlocked, spilling out talismans, chains, and rings that gleamed faintly under flickering torchlight. A young page knelt before a carved amulet, its surface darkened with age, and felt a cold prickle run down his spine, as if the object bore a memory of centuries of betrayal and blood. The air smelled of wax and iron dust stirred beneath his knees, while the shadows cast by the stone arches seemed to twist in quiet mockery of human pride. Each artifact held a story, swords that had claimed kings' rings, that had whispered deceit, chalices that had poisoned heirs, threading the lives of the powerful and powerless together in invisible, haunted lines. Through narrow arrow slits, morning sunlight fractured on the floor, catching motes of dust like ghostly witnesses to deeds long erased from record. Outside, the wind stirred a raven's wings, carrying its cry across battlements, a herald of secrets that refused to die them. Page's fingers trembled as he reached toward a rusted dagger, its handle engraved with symbols of protection turned to menace. The cold bite of metal seemed to echo through the chamber, filling the silence with tension and warning. Candle smoke swirled through the beams of light, making the relics shimmer with shifting shadows. As if each object were alive with memory and intent, the whispers of ancient servants long dead seemed to linger between the walls, while the echo of feudal ambition pressed upon every corner of the stone room. Beyond the armory, the castle corridors stretched in labyrinthine paths, each step reverberating with the weight of history. The page rose slowly, glancing at a chain coiled like a serpent on a worn table, each link Heavy with the promise of obedience and the threat of punishment, his eyes caught the glint of a silver ring carved with a crown now tarnished, yet holding the aura of those who had wielded power with cruelty and fear. The torchlight flickered over shields and helms etched with names, now forgotten their owners long turned to dust, yet the memory of triumph and terror remained embedded in the steel. Through high windows, the morning fog drifted across the courtyard, masking the figures of laboring servants and peasants who bent beneath burdens imposed by distant lords. Their voices carried faintly to the armory, mingling with the creak of timber and the scrape of boots on stone floors. A reminder of the lives that fed the machinery of castle life, the page traced the edges of a carved chalice, noting the tiny cracks and dark stains, as if the vessel had drunk the sorrow of countless generations. The smell of old wine and rust filled his nostrils, making the room heavy with the invisible weight of history. Sudden gust rattled the arrow slits, scattering motes of dust and curling the edges of parchment maps pinned to the wall. The raven shifted on its perch, tilting its head as though judging the intruder who dared to touch the relics. The page felt the cold brush of fear along his neck, an instinctive understanding that these objects bore witness and would not forgive ignorance. Each amulet and talisman seemed to pulse with the rhythm of lives lost, deeds hidden, and promises broken. Across centuries of ambition and blood, the stone floor beneath him seemed to hum with memory, the grooves and cracks worn by countless steps of knights, lords, and servants, all leaving traces in silence. The page lowered himself again toward the chest, brushing away the dust to reveal a small iron key, corroded yet precise. It seemed to beckon toward chambers not yet explored, a gateway to secrets wrapped in curses and devotions. The flicker of torchlight danced across the symbols engraved on the key, reflecting faintly in his wide eyes, a warning and an invitation all at once. Outside the courtyard, the wind carried the faint scent of charred wood from a distant hearth, mingling with the earthy aroma of frost-covered soil. The page rose, gripping the relics close, feeling the chill seep through his fingers, a tactile reminder that the castle preserved not just wealth but memory of every ambition, betrayal, and despair that had crossed its threshold. The blackbird took flight from the parapet wings, slicing through the fog, its cry trailing over battlements, as though marking the passage of history through the lives of those who dared to touch the haunted objects. In the stillness, the page paused, breathing slowly, the weight of the armory pressing upon him. Each artifact a vessel of ambition, guilt, and unseen terror. The amulet glimmered, faintly reflecting his face, distorted by fear and awe as he sensed the stories embedded in metal and stone, reaching through time to touch the living. The distant tolling of chapel bells echoed the rhythm of life and death in the valley below, marking each hour indifferent to suffering and ambition. Alike the morning light strengthened, casting long shadows that stretched across the armory floor, illuminating every curve and crack in the relics, as if revealing the invisible threads that bound lords and peasants, kings and servants, in cycles of desire, power, and ruin. The page felt the chill in his bones and the pull of unseen histories urging him to remember and to guard the memory carried. Within each talisman, chain, and chalice, the raven circled above, a silent sentinel in the fog, while the armory seemed to breathe around him, holding secrets that would shape the next chapter of lives bound by ambition, mystery, and the long shadow of objects that refuse to be forgotten. Frost clung to the thatched roofs, glittering under a pale winter sun, while the distant murmur of the river carried whispers of days long past. Within the monastery, a scholar lifted a cracked reliquary from its dusty shelf, its wood gnarled and blackened by centuries of neglect. The scent of mold and candle smoke mingled with the faint metallic temps of dried blood preserved within, and his fingers hesitated on the carved surface as if touching the memory itself. Stories of vanished abbots, cursed heirs, and forbidden rites seemed to echo from the object, threading through the echoing stone halls like a melody of fear and devotion. The scholar's quill trembled as he began to transcribe inscriptions in Latin, each character weighed with the dread of secrets too potent for mortal reckoning. Outside, the bell tower swayed with the wind, casting long shadows across the frost-hardened ground, and a blackbird hopped along the icy courtyard, silent and watchful, a messenger of both omen and history. The reliquary pressed upon the scholar's chest, a tangible sense of unseen eyes observing every thought, every hesitation, a reminder that objects carried the imprint of human folly, ambition, and suffering. The carved surface seemed to thrum under his touch, as if alive with the memory of devotion turned to despair, of prayers unheeded and pacts broken by greed or fear. Candle smoke curled in lazy spirals toward vaulted ceilings, tracing the air like the whispers of monks long dead, their voices caught between stone and shadow. Through narrow windows, the winter light fractured across cold floors, illuminating dust motes that danced like trapped souls above the worn steps and carved pews. Each inscription the scholar copied seemed to pulse with a story of those who had sought power through relics and charms, only to fall victim to the unseen calculus of fate and superstition outside. The wind rattled the bell tower, swaying the structure with a soft creak, a reminder that even stone and timber were not immune to the passage of time or the weight of memory. The scholar paused, tracing the lines of a hidden symbol carved into the reliquary, a sigil worn by centuries of handling, yet still potent with intent. He felt a shiver pass through him, as if the history bound within the wood was reaching outward, demanding recognition. The blackbird shifted its weight on the icy ground, staring with dark, unblinking eyes, a sentinel for the hidden knowledge preserved in silence and shadow. Each breath the scholar drew carried the cold tang of frost and candle soot, mingling with a growing sense of urgency, as if the objects themselves were guiding his hand toward truths too long buried in the scriptorium. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of centuries, every stroke of the quill an invocation and a warning. Each relic in the monastery's collection held the residue of ambition, faith, and terror, threading the lives of abbots, lords, and peasants. Unseen corridors of influence and ruin. The scholar's eyes lingered on the reliquary, feeling the pull of its story, urging him to look deeper, to understand the power that survived the decay of woodstone and memory. The shadows lengthened across the cold floors, the flicker of candlelight throwing grotesque shapes against carved columns and vaulted ceilings. The blackbird flitted to a ledge, watching the scholar's every move as though marking the transfer of knowledge from one hand to another. Each inscription copied seemed to echo faintly in the silence, as if the walls themselves remembered the sins and sacrifices of those who had held the relic. Before him outside the courtyard, the frost glimmered under a waning sun, masking the footprints of monks, laborers, and wandering scholars, whose lives had brushed against the monastery in fleeting moments of devotion, fear, and greed. The reliquary rested in the scholar's hands, cold, heavy, and insistent, a vessel of human folly and divine mystery. The air seemed to hum with the memory of vanished abbots, whispered prayers, and forbidden rites, each breath and motion tracing invisible lines across the century as smoke from the hearth drifted toward the vaulted ceilings. The scholar felt the weight of unseen eyes guiding him deeper into the monastery's hidden chambers. Each artifact a key to understanding the fragile boundary between superstition, faith, and power. The blackbird's wings ruffled as it lifted from the courtyard, signaling the approach of dusk and the encroaching shadow of night. The scholar's hands trembled slightly, but he continued, copying each inscription, feeling the pull of history, the echo of lives shaped by cursed objects, and the relentless rhythm of human ambition. The winter light faded, leaving only the flickering candle flames, casting long shadows across the stone floors. The reliquary seemed to glow faintly, as if acknowledging the passage of knowledge from hand to hand. Through the centuries, the scholar lowered his quill, feeling the invisible threads of fate, linking abbots, lords, and men of power bound by superstition, secrecy, and sorrow. He glanced toward the blackbird perched silently above the courtyard, a witness to all the stories yet untold, and knew that the hidden corridors of the monastery held more relics, secrets, and tragedies waiting to be revealed, shaping the lives of men and the course of empires in ways subtle and catastrophic. A low fog settled over the castle, keep muffling the clatter of iron gates and the distant cries of night watchmen. In the vaulted treasury, relics of old glimmered under torchlight, gilded chalices, jeweled daggers, and ceremonial swords, each etched with inscriptions that hummed faintly with age. A steward ran his fingers along the cold surfaces, feeling the chill of history in the grooves of metal and wood, the smell of wax and dust pressing upon him. Some of these objects had passed from hand to hand through centuries of betrayal, exile, and bloodshed, carrying the invisible weight of misfortune and vengeance. Outside, frost crept along the cobblestones, and the hush of night deepened the echo of distant bells, their sound vibrating through the walls like a whispered warning. A young novice peered from the stairwell, eyes wide at the sight of a cursed mirror, its glass warped, reflecting faces, not entirely human, shadows of past owners trapped in obsidian. Silent siege relic was a vessel of memory, guilt, and human greed, threading the fates of kings, peasants, and priests, alike in patterns invisible to the eye but undeniable to the heart. The steward's gaze lingered on a coiled chain, rusted and frayed, and he felt the tremor of inevitability, a spectral tether linking him to those who had suffered in silence. Candle smoke curled upward, brushing the cold stone ceilings like spectral fingers, marking the passage of unseen centuries. The gilded chalices glinted in the torchlight, their surfaces engraved with sigils meant to preserve blessing, yet stained by the ambition of those who coveted them. The jeweled daggers seemed to pulse with the echo of hands long gone, each cut made in secret, each oath broken, reverberating in silence through the marrow of the walls. The steward's breath drew shallow as the cold pressed upon him, filling lungs with the scent of iron and old wax. The history of greed and devotion mingled in the air like an invisible fog through narrow arrow slits, morning. Light fractured in muted beams across the stone floors, catching dust motes that floated like lost spirits above the treasures. Each object held the residue of human desire, a reminder that power was often secured at the cost of loyalty and life. The novice shivered, tracing the warped reflection of the cursed mirror, a sense of vertigo, tugging at the edge of thought, as if the glass were a portal to every crime committed in the name of ambition. The coiled chain lay heavy in the steward's hands, its rust biting through his gloves, and a shiver ran through him as if the memory of suffering bound to it reached outward, demanding recognition. The swords were lined in solemn rows, their edges dulled by age, yet sharp with the promise of stories untold. The inscriptions on the hilts whispered faintly under the torchlight, tales of kings felled by treachery, of peasants crushed beneath the wheel of taxation, of priests who betrayed their vows for gold. Smoke from hearths drifted lazily through the vaulted ceiling, curling around carved beams as the wind whispered through arrow slits, carrying the scent of frost and distant woods into the treasury. Each flicker of torchlight revealed shadows that seemed to twist in silent mockery of human pride and ambition. The novice stepped closer, feeling the pull of history tugging at the mind, threading the present with the echoes of past desires. Fear and vengeance. The gilded surfaces reflected distorted images of the steward and novice, blending with the shadow of the blackbird that had alighted on a windowsill, a silent witness to the unfolding night. It's dark. I seemed to track the movement of hands across relics, marking the passage of knowledge and warning alike. Each object vibrated with unseen energy, the remnants of those who had touched it long before their lives ended in obedience. Fear or murdering the hush of the treasury, the weight of centuries pressed upon the mind. The silence between ticks of the distant clock, filled with the unspoken consequences of ambition. Each breath the steward drew carried the history of fallen heirs, vanished lords, and betrayed monks, threading together the tapestry of human desire and folly. The novice's hands trembled, brushing the warped glass of the mirror, feeling the chill of ages and the pull of unseen eyes that had long watched over deeds, both secret and recorded as. The wind rattled the arrow slits, the fog outside thickened, cloaking the keep in a shroud that muted all sound beyond its walls. The treasures gleamed faintly under torchlight, their cold brilliance a stark contrast to the frost-bitten night beyond. Each relic was a key, a warning, a vessel of memory, shaping the lives of those who dared to touch history and the fates that entwined themselves with power, secrecy, and inevitable consequences. Steward lowered his hands, letting the chain rest on the stone floor, feeling the tremor of past and present merge into one awareness. The novice stepped back, watching the flickering shadows dance across the gilded surfaces and carved hilts, knowing that the treasury was more than a collection of metal and stone. It was a repository of human ambition, obsession, and lingering curses, guiding the lives of men unseen and relentless. As the passage of time, the blackbird took flight, outside wings slicing the fog, signaling that the night would carry these stories forward into the unfolding chapters of power, betrayal, and the silent echo of objects that refused to be forgotten. Morning mist rolled across the ruins of a forgotten abbey, muffling the distant calls of crows and the sigh of wind through fractured arches. Amid the rubble, a traveler lifted a cracked reliquary, its interior lined with faded velvet, inhaling the sharp tang of aged metal and incense that had long since lost its flame. Tiny scratches darkened with time-traced patterns of hands, long gone each, mark humming with the memory of prayers unanswered and secrets betrayed. Outside, crows circled the skeletal towers, their cries cutting through the cold air like knives of mortality. The traveler's boots crunched over frost-coated stones, tracing the path of history embedded in the ruins, imagining the rusted keys that had unlocked vaults of hidden knowledge, the ropes that had restrained both heretics and heirs. Candlelight flickered across the surfaces of nearby ruins, casting shadows that stretched like grasping fingers into the past. The relic had moved silently through markets and castles coveted by lords and clerics alike, leaving in its wake the fevered coughs of those who mishandled it, the quiet despair of those undone by ambition. Each surface of the reliquary bore the invisible imprint of human desire, ambition, and folly, a record of devotion turned to decay that pressed against the traveler's chest, a weight both physical and spiritual. He traced the edges of the worn metal, feeling the cold bite of history seep into his fingers, sensing the accumulation of centuries. Threaded through its form, a single raven, perched atop a broken arch, observed him, its black eye gleaming in the pale light, a sentinel of secrets too potent for mortal reckoning. The air smelled of damp stone smoke and the distant temps of iron, as though the very ruins exhaled the memory of those who had once knelt within them. The traveler's gaze lingered on the reliquary, as if reading the silent ledger of human frailty, etched in scratches and tarnish. Each shadow cast by the flickering candlelight seemed to animate the past, the folds of fabric and splintered pews reaching toward him, whispering of devotion, broken of vows, betrayed of lives bent beneath invisible forces that shaped empires and faith alike. He imagined the hands that had carried the relic through courts and monasteries, the secretive exchanges in darkened halls, the whispered prayers that had sought protection from a force unseen. The frost beneath his feet seemed to anchor the weight of those stories, pressing upward through the soles of his boots, threading time into a single, unbroken line of consequence and memory. The candlelight danced across the cracked surfaces, revealing hidden sigils and faint engravings, a map of ambition and fear woven into metal and velvet. The traveler shivered, feeling the pull of unseen eyes that had long watched over the relic, the echoes of whispered curses and forgotten rites, stirring in the quiet spaces between stone and shadow. Outside the skeletal towers, the wind rose, carrying the cries of circling crows through the abbey, like a lament for what had been lost. The reliquary pressed harder against the traveler's chest, a silent testimony to the lives it had haunted, the choices it had influenced, the ambitions it had nurtured or destroyed. Each breath drew the scent of damp stone and aged incense into his lungs, mingling past and present in a chorus of memory and warning. He knelt amid the rubble, tracing the faded inscriptions as if summoning the voices of those long gone. The cracks in the wood seemed to whisper names forgotten by history, the weight of unspoken guilt, the desperation of prayers that had never found favor. The frost crept along his cloak as the candlelight flickered once more, casting the ruins into a landscape of shadows and half-remembered devotion. The raven lifted from its perch wings, slicing through the morning mist, signaling the continuity of watchfulness, the persistence of memory, and the inevitability of history threading forward through those who dared touch relics of power. The traveler felt the relic's presence linger, a constant pressure, urging reflection, caution, and reverence in equal measure, the stories it carried reaching into the hearts of the living, as well as the echoes of the dead in the quiet of the ruined abbey with frost glinting on collapsed arches. The traveler rose carrying the weight of centuries in his hands, each step a careful negotiation between awe and fear. The relic seemed to breathe with him, a pulse of human ambition, devotion, and error threading together past and present, a silent witness to lives undone by desire and choices unexamined. The morning mist thickened around the skeletal towers, cloaking them in a shroud of anticipation, hinting that the paths opened by this relic were far from complete, and that the stories yet to emerge would be written in shadows and whispered through time. A cold drizzle pattered against the stone walls of the fortress, dripping into moss-covered gutters, carrying the faint metallic scent of rain mingled with iron and soot. In a dim corner of the armory, a sword lay partially sheathed, its hilt engraved, with symbols of protection turned sinister, darkened with age and use. A young page approached hesitant, feeling the chill run through his gloves, aware that the air itself seemed charged with old sorrow and forgotten wrath. The relic had passed from battlefield to battlefield, leaving whispers of misfortune in the wake of its owner's lords, who fell to betrayal, soldiers whose courage faltered, peasants whose crops withered inexplicably. Torchlight flickered across the stone floor, revealing chains, rusted rings, and ceremonial daggers tucked into shadows, each an emblem of human ambition and its shadowed consequences. Outside, the wind stirred the tattered banners above the keep, sending a low moan echoing across the courtyard, blending with the distant cry of a raven circling the battlements. The page's breath fogged in the cold air as he traced the pattern of a scarred emblem on the sword's crossguard, feeling the unbroken chain of human desire, guilt, and fear inscribed in metal and memory. Each groove seemed to hum with the footsteps of soldiers long dead, the whispered commands of lords whose names had vanished into dust, the silent suffering of those who had been caught between ambition and obedience. He knelt beside the sword, feeling the cold bite of iron pressing into his palms, the weight of centuries resting in his hands. The torchlight caught the edge of the blade, glinting faintly as if remembering the moments it had drawn blood or defended lives. Each scar along its surface told a story of courage, betrayed of alliances, broken of promises, carved into flesh and stone, and left to rot in silence. Chains, coiled like serpents along the floor, seemed to reach toward him, murmuring of captives and bargains. Struck in desperation, rusted rings bore the marks of fingers that had trembled with greed or knelt in prayer to beg favor from gods who remained silent. Daggers tucked into shadowed corners carried the memory of betrayal hidden in plain sight, each edge a testament to human cunning and fear. The wind carried a sharper bite through the courtyard, lifting the banners to flap violently against the stone towers. The raven circled higher, its wings cutting through the mist above the battlements, a sentinel of warning and witness. The page's eyes lingered on the sword, as though seeking an answer to questions that had no voice. The stories, embedded in steel, offering both terror and understanding, he imagined the passage of the sword through hands both noble and ignoble, its gleaming edge tasting blood in the sun and frost alike. Lords had schemed over it, soldiers had prayed beside it, peasants had cursed it under breath in moments of quiet despair. The relic absorbed every intent, every hope, every act of fear and courage, leaving traces invisible to the eye, but undeniable to the soul. The torchlight flickered as shadows danced across the walls, elongating the forms of chains and weapons into shapes that seemed alive in the gloom. The page shivered, feeling the sword's presence press against his chest, a subtle pressure that reached into memory and expectation, pressing him to acknowledge the lives it had touched and the consequences it carried beyond mortal reckoning. Rain ran down the fortress walls, carrying the scent of iron and stone into the cold night. The sound of water pattering against gutters blended with distant bells echoing through the valley, marking time for those who had long since passed. Yet in the armory the sword remained alive in its stillness, a silent witness to suffering, devotion, betrayal, and the relentless hand of history threading through those who dared touch it. The page rose slowly, tracing a final finger along the cold hilt, feeling the chill seep into his very bones. He looked toward the courtyard, where banners flapped violently against the wind, and the raven circled above, a dark harbinger of secrets carried through centuries. The sword remained poised between past and present, a vessel of memory and warning, guiding the mind to reckon with the unseen power of objects shaped by human desire and lingering beyond their endmakers. Intent in the quiet of the fortress, the drizzle continued its soft assault on stone and moss, each drop a reminder that history flows like water over obstacles, carrying with it both reflection and reckoning. The page clutched the sword, close, aware that the journey of understanding had only begun, that within its cold steel rested lessons of ambition, greed, courage, and fear that would reach into the hearts of those who came after, whispering truths that the world was neither kind nor forgiving. Shadows stretched long across the cobblestone streets as dusk settled, the smell of wet earth and wood smoke thick in the air. Within a decaying manor, a chest of artifacts waited its lock, rusted, the hinges creaking softly with each movement of the wind. A historian knelt, fingers brushing against a jewel-encrusted crucifix, feeling the bite of cold metal and the faint residue of centuries of devotion and betrayal. The air was dense with the mingled scents of candle smoke, damp stone, and the acrid tang of old blood preserved within hidden compartments. Outside, a raven alighted on the windowsill, its black eye reflecting the flicker of a single torch, silent yet vigilant. Each relic held a story, an amulet that had undone a dynasty, a ring that whispered deceit to kings, a goblet that had claimed lives through poison and neglect, threads of human ambition and folly binding the present to the shadowed past. Through the hall, distant bells tolled, carrying the weight of unremembered prayers, and the sighs of the forgotten dust motes danced in shafts of waning light, tracing invisible lines of fear and reverence across the floor. The historian traced a cracked inscription with a trembling finger, sensing the weight of curses and the pull of memory embedded in stone, metal, and wood. Each groove seemed to hum with the whispers of those who had knelt in hope or trembled in despair. The silent hands that had carried ambition forward and paid the price. He imagined the passage of each relic through hands, both noble and ignoble, the crucifix once carried through courts in solemn procession, the amulet hidden beneath velvet cloaks in secret chambers. The goblet passed at feasts where laughter masked plotting and fear. The objects bore the echoes of prayers, unheeded vows broken and greed sharpened into deeds that echoed beyond the walls of the manor and into the wider world. The torchlight flickered, casting moving shadows along the cracked plaster and wooden beams. Shadows that seemed to stretch fingers toward the historian, as if reaching from the past. Each artifact carried an imprint of human desire and dread that clung to the metal and stone, like a persistent fragrance that could not be washed away. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of centuries holding vigil over the living and the dead. He leaned closer to the crucifix, feeling the chill of metal sink into his skin, the tiny scratches along its surface, whispering of hands that had trembled in prayer and others that had clenched in anger, each mark a memory, each dent a story of hope betrayed or courage extinguished. The relics were silent, yet their presence spoke volumes of the forces that shaped lives unseen and consequences that endured beyond intent. Sudden gust rattled the windows, sending the raven into a flutter of wings, its sharp cry slicing through the stillness of the hall. The historian's eyes followed its shadow as it moved across broken floorboards and shattered remnants of past lives. The chest creaked as if exhaling the secrets of its contents, the lock groaning under the weight of its years, and the invisible energy of all who had touched its chains. Coiled in a darkened corner, gleamed faintly in torchlight, like serpents waiting in patience. Rings etched with symbols of power seemed to hum in resonance with one another, each one a subtle reminder of human/ambition, striving against the constraints of mortality and fate. Daggers hidden beneath velvet folds caught reflections that hinted at deeds done in darkness, promises broken, and blood spilled in silence. He traced a finger along a carved inscription on the goblet, its edges worn smooth by hands long gone. The letters whispered of indulgence and sacrifice of kings and peasants alike, caught in the web of consequences spun by desire and fear. The air seemed heavier with every touch, as though the room itself absorbed memory and evoked anticipation, guiding the historian deeper into the lineage of greed, courage, and hidden sins. Outside, the bells continued to toll their deep resonance, drifting through the fog that crept along the manor's exterior, marking time for those long forgotten. Each note seemed to carry the sighs of those whose lives had been shaped by objects that demanded more than mere possession, that exacted their own form of obedience and remembrance. The historian felt the pulse of centuries in his chest, each relic a heartbeat connecting the living to the past. He rose slowly, keeping his gaze on the crucifix, the amulet, and the goblet, aware that the journey through their histories was only beginning. Each artifact was a doorway into the hidden corridors of human obsession and devotion, a reminder that even in decay, the forces of ambition and memory could shape lives beyond their maker's understanding. The raven perched again on the windowsill, watching silent sentinel as dusk deepened into night, and the manor held its breath in the quiet. He placed a hand upon the chest, feeling the cold weight of history pressing upward through the worn wood. The relics seemed to vibrate softly beneath his touch, as if acknowledging his presence and inviting him further into the stories that lay buried within stone, iron, and velvet within the shadows. The hallway stretched outward corridors of forgotten ambition and hidden truths awaiting the next step toward understanding the enduring power of objects that haunted the human heart